I know that there are people in this room who've been following this issue for longer than I have, and then I also hope that there's people who are newer to this issue and joining in. So just to recap, the affirmation model encourages all children to contemplate their gender, and then when a child presents with gender dysphoria, the model assumes that that child is naturally trans or gender diverse, and any mental health problems the child is experiencing are considered to be due to the stigma of being trans in an oppressive cis heteronormative world, which is what they term minority stress. The affirmation model encourages children with gender dysphoria down a pathway of social transition, puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones and gender surgeries. And as part of that process of affirmation, it encourages them to connect to the queer community, to promote gender diversity and fight for trans rights. The environment I was working in the hospital, was one where raising concerns or questions about the affirmation model was not tolerated. Allegiance was signalled by wearing rainbow lanyards and ally and pronoun badges and having transgender pride flags on the walls. The Gender Clinic provided a lot of education sessions across the hospital, actually across the state, on the affirmation model. And there was a hospital work instruction on the treatment of gender dysphoria, which mandated that all mental health clinicians across the entire enormous district were required to take an affirming approach towards children. I'm currently involved in a legal battle with the Queensland Children's Hospital over whether concerns I raised about the Gender Clinic in mid-2022 qualify as a public interest disclosure. This process has shown me that we need to have very strong whistleblower protections because organisations can be vicious towards one of their own who they perceive to be being disloyal to their agenda. My claim is that I blew the whistle during 2 meetings held with senior hospital clinical directors in June 2022. At that time, I advised them that I was concerned about the increasing number of children and adolescents presenting as trans and the risks associated with puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones, including that of infertility, impaired sexual functioning and long-term physical health problems. I also raised concerns that hospital staff were failing to take a cautious and exploratory approach to children with gender dysphoria and were instead praising them for being transgender and pressuring parents to affirm their child's claimed gender identity. In its original assessment, and in 2 subsequent internal reviews of the decision, the hospital HR staff and hospital executives decided that what I said did not constitute a public interest disclosure. And they gave the reasons why it didn't to be that the harms to children were not substantial and not specific enough. They said I didn't honestly hold my concerns, and they said that the Gender Clinic's treatments were evidence-based. So I've appealed the hospital's decision regarding the public interest disclosure to the Queensland Industrial Relations Commission, and the matter's expected to be resolved in coming weeks. Okay, time for a single question quiz. And the challenge is to identify, I'm going to read a statement, and the challenge is to identify where this statement is from. Our case studies revealed numerous instances where institutions ignored or minimised complaints, engaged in poor investigation standards, and did not assess and manage risks to the safety of children in their care. The mishandling of complaints has meant that some allegations were not properly investigated and children were not adequately protected. Can anyone recognise where that's from? Not the CAS?
Royal Commission.
Yes, into institutional sexual abuse, yes. So it's part of the report from the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sex Abuse. And I've been desperately looking at that report to see if I can gain some understanding of how it can be that in places seemingly dedicated to the well-being of children, so many people can look the other way when it comes to protecting children from harm. It's disturbing that we haven't been able to use our knowledge of what's happened in the past to do better now. I feel there are significant similarities with the institutional responses to sexual abuse to what's going on in the hospital regarding the harm to children with gender dysphoria, because senior people in the hospital are tolerating what's going on and avoiding speaking up. And also, hospital executives are not just looking the other way, but are aggressively protecting the clinic, which is what I've seen through my legal interactions with them. The publication of the Cass Review final report on 10th of April this year has made it painfully clear what hospital executives and child psychiatrists can no longer claim to not know, that the medical and surgical transitioning of children is not based on reliable evidence. The sensitively phrased statements in the Cass Review regarding the shaky foundations and the lack of evidence of benefit are not lost on those of us working in the health field. We are aware that this lack of evidence of benefit has persisted for over the 20 years in which activist researchers have been desperately trying to demonstrate evidence of benefit. Activists have repeatedly claimed that their studies show evidence of benefit, and they've put that in their journal titles and in their abstracts, which are viewable by everyone online. And then clinicians need to take the time to read the full research article, which is usually behind a paywall, to see that the claimed benefits were not actually borne out in the research and the study's findings. The Cass Review was commissioned in September 2020 by the UK government in response to concerns by whistleblower clinicians, families and patients of the Tavistock Gender Identity Development Service. And the review contracted the University of York to undertake 8 systematic reviews of the global research literature to underpin its recommendations. These systematic reviews revealed that the evidence regarding puberty suppression and cross-sex hormones is of such poor quality that no foundation exists for clinical decisions to be made and for patients or their parents to be able to provide informed consent. A diagnosis of gender dysphoria does not predict an enduring trans identity. In July 2023, so almost a year ago, and 10 months before the publication of the final Cass Review report, Dr. Hilary Cass, the lead of the review, wrote to the NHS to recommend that the use of puberty blockers be restricted to an ethics-approved clinical trial. So this was an opportunity for our Queensland Children's Hospital to act quickly to make changes to protect children, but unfortunately they just ignored this information and continued on regardless. In its final report, the Cass Review has recommended that cross-sex hormones be used with extreme caution in people between the age of 16 and 18, with approval for their prescribing required from an independent expert panel. The report cautions that social transition is an active intervention that may have significant effects on a child's psychological functioning and long-term outcomes. It concluded the evidence does not adequately support the claim that gender-affirming treatment reduces suicide risk. And it recommended that the treatment for gender dysphoria should not be based on the gender-affirming model, but instead it should treat children with gender distress similarly to how we treat other children with developmental struggles. ABC and Guardian media reports have claimed that the findings of the Cass Review are not relevant to Australia because Australian paediatric gender clinics are multidisciplinary and holistic, apparently unlike the UK gender clinic. However, it is notable that the service specification documents for the UK's gender clinic similarly describe their clinic as multidisciplinary, holistic and tailored to the needs of the individual and their family. And this shows that worldwide, health service executives will employ deceptive rhetoric describing their health services. And it shows that in Australia they're doing that in order to not make changes to protect children. Freedom of Information data from Australian paediatric gender clinics indicates that they prescribe puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones at very high rates. In 2022, our Queensland Gender Clinic started 80 children on puberty blockers and 102 children on cross-sex hormones and had 922 children under their care. The year later, in 2023, the clinic started 172 children on puberty blockers, 273 children on cross-sex hormones and had 899 children under their care. So the number of children started on puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones has doubled in the space of 1 year, while the number of children under the care of the clinic has only slightly decreased. It's important to know that on many domains, our Queensland Gender Clinic is worse than that of the UK Gender Clinic. The Queensland Gender Clinic prescribes cross-sex hormones from the age of 14, whereas in contrast, the UK Gender Clinic only prescribed cross-sex hormones from around the time of the child's 16th birthday. Another difference is that for children approaching puberty, the Queensland Gender Service provides 3 intake and assessment appointments before referring a child for hormonal interventions. Although I do know personally of cases where it's been only 1 or 2 appointments. But in contrast, the UK Gender Clinic had a 4 to 6 session assessment model, and that was roundly criticised for rushing children onto hormones. Here in Queensland, we have conversion therapy legislation in place where the UK didn't and doesn't. And this legislation makes the experienced and ethical clinicians avoid providing exploratory therapy to children and adolescents with gender dysphoria, and that functions to funnel children towards the gender clinic and towards those private providers who take an affirming approach. In Brisbane, private surgery clinics are performing double mastectomies on adolescent females from the age of 15, whereas in the UK, gender surgeries are not conducted on people until they're aged 18. Queensland Children's Hospital administration procedures mean that a child's preferred name and pronoun is recorded at the time of registration by an administration officer, which facilitates the immediate social transition of the child before any clinical assessment is conducted. Contrary to what advocates are saying, Australian paediatric gender clinics are not holistic. They provide a really narrow scope of intervention. They only provide gender-affirming care. So while clinicians from various professional backgrounds are employed in the gender clinic, this does not expand the treatments provided. So say, for example, a speech pathologist employed in the gender clinic, they will do masculinising and feminising voice training, but they won't do general communication assessments or work on improving the child's general communication or they won't do social skills training. And similarly, for example, the endocrinologist will prescribe puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones, but they won't treat the child's other hormone problems like diabetes or obesity. What this means is that children with gender dysphoria in Australia presenting to Australian gender clinics are not receiving comprehensive multidisciplinary assessment and treatment for the various pre-existing and co-occurring mental health conditions or psychological issues that may be contributing to their distress. The CAS Review's position of recommending future research trials raises the question, how much longer do we need to allow these researchers to experiment on children to try to establish some evidence of benefit? This ongoing research will be occurring in an academic context where there are insufficient measures to identify when scientific fraud has taken place. Like all gender clinics in Australia, the Queensland Children's Gender Service affirmation model is underpinned by the WPATH standards of care and the Australian Standards of Care and Treatment Guidelines for Trans and Gender Diverse Children and Adolescents, which is the Royal Children's Hospital guideline. These guidelines were appraised as part of the CAS review and were given unacceptably low scores for rigour of development, applicability and editorial independence. So the CAS review has demonstrated that these guidelines cannot be relied upon and should no longer guide the gender interventions provided to children in Australia. An evaluation of the Queensland Children's Gender Service commenced in December 2023 and was supposed to conclude last month, but the report has not been released. The 7-member panel included 4 members known to be hardline gender activists, which is likely to influence the outcome of the report if the report ever comes to light. The AMA Queensland was invited to make a submission to the inquiry. That's the Australian Medical Association. And their submission highlighted that the clinicians in the clinic are feeling very stressed and burned out by the media attention on their clinic. The clinic has had a lot of trouble finding staff. It's meant to have 11 full-time staff, and I hear that staffing's dropped below 50%. But the clinic is continuing to advertise for new staff through AusPath and online, and the advertisements continue to specify that the clinicians must provide gender-affirming care. And that issue of being mandated to provide the one affirming model brings me to the second legal matter I have, which is an appeal, again to the Queensland Industrial Relations Commission, for a claim of being politically discriminated, because I believe that a government policy should not require a health practitioner to take an affirming approach against their gender-critical beliefs. So this case relates to whether it was lawful for my employer to impose upon me the lawful direction that I must always use the preferred pronouns of children, always take an affirming approach, and always refer gender-questioning children to the gender clinic. So I'll just finish with a little bit of nostalgia. I'm hoping you might cast your mind back to primary school when you'd come inside from lunch, settle back into your seat, and after a few moments, the teacher would suddenly say in a bit of a stern voice something like, "Can all those students who are playing on the oval at lunchtime please stand up?" And the atmosphere in the classroom, you might remember, would sink like a stone. There would be silence as everyone in the room contemplated about what they knew about what had happened on the oval, whether they were involved, whether they needed to stand up. Well, long after primary school is over, the Queensland Children's Hospital executives are metaphorically still choosing to remain seated. They have not yet reckoned with their complicity in one of the saddest medical scandals in modern history. I implore them to please stand up, take responsibility, and urgently implement the recommendations of the CAS review. Sorry.